Hello everyone, briefly today a topic that actually would deserve a bit more consideration in general, but fundamentally the criterion of appointment of officers in the French Royal Army. Yeah, we can hint a bit at the, also the early revolutionary phase of France, right, of course. And a big question for essentially two orders of reason. The first of all, this could broadly fit into the history of the development of the officiality of officers, properly meant, with a France that was pioneering fundamentally military development in Europe throughout all the period, right, since Louis XIV. France literally takes off, right, the big step after in the history of modern warfare, let's say, in the central modern era properly is Louis XIV military reforms that at some point we will see also in detail, right? We're talking properly about the enlargement, the enormous enlargement of the base, or the pool of recruitment in the first place, accompanied also with a essentially a political social engineering that, as you know, we start to call as properly monarchic absolutism, but that, as a matter of fact, as it happens basically in every monarchic regime, tries to, counterbalance the weight of the nobility also with the one of the lower classes, right? Because fundamentally the monarchy emerges a bit like the king as a primus inter pares compared to the nobility. France naturally had a long history of statal development proper, but still very marked by the role properly of the aristocracy in a feudal sense, right? Because of the enormous wealth and resources concentrated in the single hands of these people, that is said here, so we're starting being co-opted in a game of power around the newly built Versailles residence, and appointed with the highest properly offices to the highest offices of the kingdom and its empire, because naturally here we are in full colonial age, and therefore the creation of new hierarchies at the very top, where the high nobility, as we will see, would always maintain till the French Revolution actually the privileged path, but also the constant integration of other of other elements within the same officiality, right? This happens, as we were saying before, in a time in which properly the official ranks per se were not regulated Europe-wide, right? It was something new, relatively. This is a moment where big things happen in France, mostly pioneers on the creation of divisions, the enlargement of armies, the interaction of multiple armies on a regular base and broader fronts. Here we skip also, military engineering with Vauban, and with properly this eminently terrestrial military culture that French dominated in Europe from, right? From the position essentially of an hegemonic power that all the rest of the continent would coalesce, basically, especially at the beginning of this period, to stem, right? And that boosted, in fact, as a reaction also in the other countries, the necessity for, some centralizing reforms that were, if you study it, even from a juridical point of view, were basically all principally aimed at maintaining a standing army, right? Certain powers, even a important caliber like Austria or Prussia, would arrive actually fairly late in the process, by the mid-18th century, to have something, like a properly permanent professional army. France triggered this obvious reaction with, that is simply spirit of survival from threat of annihilation. And naturally the French model was to dominate for a long time, right? Essentially even even during the 19th century, even after defeat against Prussia, France was always considered as a standard of military equality that was fundamentally unparalleled, historically speaking. From the other side, we also have, as we've seen, fundamentally this struggle for essentially modernizing the system at a level that could integrate properly on a meritocratic base. Right, Louis XIV marched towards that direction, so heading France paradoxically towards the same development that eventually would bring to the revolution itself, because the middle classes were ever more powerful, and they said, why do does the nobility have to maintain their privileges at some point? A decade before the revolution, as we've seen, there would be even probably a nobility lock on officers' posts. That was a bit, the of swan song in spite of the restoration, and still the fact that it was properly the French Royal Army. We've seen it in the video we made in May about the Napoleon's contribution specifically to the art of war, that would have basically, without which the French Revolutionary Army, and this further, huge, gigantic step forward in the art of war, right, at that point in the world, because the West at that point had concretely surpassed, especially from the 7 Years War and onwards, the rest of the world, the French Revolutionary achievements could have not existed, I was saying, without properly what the French Royal Army had been, and in fact, even during the Revolution, there was factually a mixed system, because still, the new levies were nobody had properly even managed that system altogether, probably from a quantitative point of view, that is properly mass warfare entering this scene. Let's try to go by order. So, speaking of the official ranks per se, they're the first example of a logical regulation in France is constituted by the so-called Ordre des Tableaux of 1675. That was bringing a certain order, right, at least from a theoretical point of view, also in the thorny matter of the promotions, right? What could not really be done in any way, to solve in any way, because it basically would touch the heart of the Ancien Regime as such, was the nobiliar monopoly on the officiality ranks, and even less the ambiguous mechanisms of favor of the court in the appointments to generalship, right? So these were properly individuals presented to the king that would be appointed with the main posts, because still of the relevance that the nobility had in the realm, right? It was basically 3 steps, right? Because the petty nobility, that was the one that had been always incentivized to join the army in a sense, even from as non-officers fundamentally, was the bulk and as a compromise of what fundamentally the French army would try to build its officiality during the 18th century. There were still, as we will see, some bourgeois, but these were still fundamentally an exception, at least they were kept under. Here we are properly also transitioning a bit, the Louis XIV properly from a different period in the art of war proper to another, right? So some changes have still not taken place. For example, in his father's times, Louis XIII's officers were still, encouraged, for example, to join the army as regular soldiers. This was a Spanish fashion that was imitated also elsewhere since the 16th century, especially in the Habsburgic, in fact, armies altogether. That was a bit anti-aristocratic, especially for French standards, right? The Spanish hidalgos were a very different thing from French nobility, but properly there was the idea that these men, that were, after all, as we will see, mostly as career opportunities, wouldn't have much different from war, but sometimes they lacked the means themselves, so that bourgeois could become even richer than them, especially in the long run, right, could see this as an option. But it was also probably a different way to make war, right? Louis XIII's times still pike and shot warfare fundamentally, so that it would be also normal. In many ways, even because armies were smaller, the importance of the individual officers was greater. Let's say properly at a combat level. In Louis XIV's time, still it was thought that officers had, for example, to charge with their men, right? So it was a very different world from the one would be that developing in the 18th century in general, right? Not that those things did not happen. In fact, we'll see also how the French looked at different military systems and said, wow, at least the French nobility, right? That they didn't have much to, France didn't have much to envy to others, but still there were other systems that functioned differently, where the aristocracy was, for example, still the only one in charge. This was especially true in Germany, in Prussia, right? And where, some problems were not present there, but why? Because, the political and social situation was different, right? And it was different actually in favor of France. There was this enormous, gigantic system by any standard, political, social, military, economical, demographic, as always, creating this, and it's still, so big that it was difficult to regulate internally with this enormous push that eventually would explode into the revolution. That reflected at that point, as the middle classes could not be deprived of for having a functional system that, incidentally, as we were saying before, evolved into the nation state, and even in there, the new French wave of drama that at that point would, in fact, conquer the whole Europe literally, and to which no other system was up to, right? So certain powers had that were invested, but had barely managed to create functional military systems on a professional military level by Ancien Regime standards. And the French Revolution arrived. It was like there are those memes that they're always the bigger guy, in the back of it. Just it's more or less always France at this point doing the thing. So it is true that gradually in France the nobiliar monopoly of the officiality was shifted in the substance, well, not even also in the form, right, of the matter. But for example, at the beginning of the 18th century, it had become rather common that the appointment to officer was conferred on basically by purchasing the brevet, the charter, obviously, because this was still it, right? The system worked with somebody paying for obtaining the single regiments, their tasks, etc., as it was before, right? That's the great difference that eventually the nation state will bring, because this system was still fundamentally working still on a private base in a sense, right? The king in France was just enormously powerful, and public authority was growing, but still it was still a matter of individual appointments and purchasing, because also the crown cashed through that, right? So there was also huge competition, as you can imagine, because as always, it was a matter of promotion and of with this continuous competition. Yeah, the officers tended to make money out of these subcontracts, but they still had to respond individually of their troops on the field. So it wasn't just simply because otherwise the system would have simply gone downhill. Right, so this was actually the best way at the time. So this appointment to officiality was conferred to the bourgeois already, right, and to those specifically that were capable to lead a nobiliar lifestyle. That, aside from the metaphor, meant bourgeois well provided with means, right, even if such expression was at that point devoid of effective contact with reality, since there were authentic noblemen that from that point of view couldn't lead any kind of properly nobiliar lifestyle. And many of these bourgeois officers were actually looked upon with with contempt from their colleagues and from certain environments of the court, right? They were dismissed as soon as the military needs were relaxed, but so you understand why, because they were basically erected as the kingdom needed to field an ever great force of troops, properly from a quantitative point of view. They needed properly the money for it. That is, surely France didn't lack demographic resources. The problem was having somebody who could pay for properly maintaining these units on the field, and to maintain expenses also in a broader sense, because the system was ever more centralizing, so the state was properly providing ever more for these resources through civil reforms, tax, cadastre, all these things that were being pioneered. Think about Colbert and so on. So, but in many ways, still at the beginning of the 18th century, the Sun King's time still, from one side, the king was probably actually pushing for these bourgeois to rise, not much because he would care about them, but properly by very pragmatic necessity. But once war was over, of course, also for most of the rest of the troops, also these people would be the first one to go, right, to be dismissed, to have their troops disbanded, it is to be demanded if by chance the remedy was not worse than the evil, given that to the rich bourgeois was offered the opportunity to buy a nobiliary title through the brevet of appointment in the army, and that it ended up that basically they introduced a lifestyle that the poor provincial noblesse, that would be a bit like the equivalent of the Prussian Junker, was not absolutely capable to imitate. As we were saying before, here it was mostly cashing the money. Then eventually the army was taking over, the state were properly taking over the centralization, the supplies, etc. It was enormous work, properly from an administrative point of view. And behind this, the same middle classes, right, and we're looking at where did they come from. We're saying once they were working into this enormous statal apparatus as it was being developed, right? So properly, the typical aristocrat, right, of a pre-industrial society in the countryside, having lands, farms, whatever, would become essentially ever more, let's say, outdated for even properly political and social standards at that point, because the country's powers was not measured much anymore through that kind of personalistic clientelary scale. And you understand conversely, and we will see it now, that countries as Prussia could work better by a certain degree, not much at the end of the day because they were more modern, but because in that case especially the metus hostilities pressed dramatically for centralization, yes, proportionally, but also properly because they didn't have much of a different social class to draw officers, right? And still in that world, aristocracy had a much greater weight in relative terms compared to the modern and developed France, right? So this is particularly important. The higher ranks of the French army in the 18th century were clogged up by the children of the enriched, of the bourgeois, right, properly, that were known as routiers, and also by members of courtesan families that had achieved, success within that world, maybe without being particularly powerful. Previously, that was a typical monarchic move, right, to make, as we were saying before, rise certain specific, even petty noblemen to higher tasks, whereas that there were, even people that didn't have much of a nobiliary status at their back. And then there were also the young noblemen, of course, that were surely more provided with military attitudes, but maybe they were children of poor or scarcely influenced parents, right? They didn't have, thus, even as noblemen, any possibility of career. And think about this, because we have seen it even with the Prince Eugene series, right? He actually came from one of the most important families in Europe, in France at the time. He literally lived at Versailles. Eventually, he fell. His family fell out of grace. He was without money. He was isolated, from the court, and he didn't have money, right? And he couldn't make a career at that point much. So what does he do? He actually goes over to the Habsburgs and actually finds a job with more precarious means, with all the frustrations that we have seen, but still, right, at least for fighting, because these people literally wanted to, well, aside, of course, personal inclination could be different, but generally speaking, there's the Grand Siècle and the libertines, all, you understand, how these young men lived, right? Pure radical violence at every level of their some of the most ferocious, abusive, properly evil behavior, because they were meant to toughen up. It's how fundamentally aristocracy had always cemented its even psychological prowess needed for war historically. Just now the world was changing in a way that such model was becoming ever more anachronistic. So as in most times it happened, most advanced realities, no money, you can't really do much, right? Sadly enough, even when you're actually talented, right? What a better example of Prince Eugene, that Louis XIV would say, it was my greatest mistake to have refused him as an officer in my army, right? That was said by the Sun King, right? Not just a random guy, passing by the street. Not even a random monarch in Europe by those standards, let me tell you. So many noblemen at that point were frustrated about this, because they were enormously arrogant, right? The nobility, of course, understood themselves as sort of properly as a different race from the rest of the population. They believed properly they had a psychophysical superior quality, so they would hate the guts, these other, newcomers, these newly enriched, gentrified, and they extraneated as a consequence ever more from the regime itself, right? Always remember this, that an absolutistic autocratic regime is not properly winking at the nobility. Quite the contrary, right? He was basically proceeding towards the substitution with a functional state. So these young men yearned, for example, what was happening in places like, across the Rhine, right? Because they found in Germany, that was still a feudal country fundamentally, examples of a Spartan, but for their standards definitely, but still, because they were individually still richer in absolute terms, but still aristocratic efficiency, right? Or some others at that point in the century of the Loom dreamt of different military systems that seemed more adventurous and exciting and based on a more meritocratic criterion. That especially after 1776, right? They began to spot on the other shore of the Atlantic, where definitely also the same French intervened, for that matter, in favor of the Americans. So a reflection of such tensions, such hopes, such illusions and disillusions that a huge and incalculable, weight must have had in the events immediately previous to the French Revolution and the contemporary ones too in its first phase, is a work, a very smart one, by Philippe Auguste de Sainte-Foy, Chevalier d'Arc, on which maybe sometime we will comment. That is really very fascinating. By the mid-18th century, roughly 1/3 of the French infantry officers was composed by bourgeois that had purchased the appointment brevet, or that came alternatively, that had actually risen through the ranks by merit in its service. And above them, naturally, kept remaining the generals and colonels of noble blood, right, and also the ones, as we've seen, were the newcomers appointed by the court, that were, however, devoid of military competence and experience, which worsened, among the other things, the tensions between a bourgeoisie that felt to count ever more in the army as in civil life, and a petty nobility that saw itself caught between two fires, from bourgeoisie itself that essentially deprived it of the prestige and power, and by the high aristocracy, right? Those guys that had made it to the ultra top, we're saying now, were being detached from the petty nobility, and this high aristocracy that was fundamentally inept, though, from a military point of view, on the base of which, by the way, the same nobility altogether was judged wrongly, by the way, in block by the rest of society, because they said, the nobility. Who was the nobility actually, got those privileges without actual much of military competence there? Well, it was the highest, right? The petty nobility were lots of them, and those were actually keeping to be actually some of the probably the best officers that made this pretty big thing of the French Royal Army work by very good standards. So eventually, the nobiliar reaction before the revolution would have led to the Lock of 1781, which is in consequence of which the appointment to officiality could be maintained only by those bourgeois that would have achieved it up to that point, but in general without obtaining promotions, and therefore becoming placed put at rest, let's say, with modest pensions, right? So not to inflate further the weight of these individuals. And this, here we are just 1 decade before the revolution, and you know how eventually things went. Even in there, not randomly, but surely importantly also through the same war. I mean, think about the enormous effort, commitment in the American War of Independence that literally made the French crown spend an enormity of money, and that had come as a success, but let's say after the loss of the 7 Years' War that had deprived, as you know, France of basically the most important North American and Indian and also other territories. The attitude of the noblesse d'épée, right, in this circumstance may even seem obtuse to us, but it should also be taken into consideration that the poorer strata of the nobility proper did not have ecclesiastical career aside, and for the petty nobility, not even the latter, because it wouldn't bring them much further, because in the clergy basically it was the same thing, of true and proper career opportunities for its children besides the career in the army, right? However, the 1781 reform didn't resolve the military matter, given that the higher ranks, in fact, remained in the hands of the high nobility and of the court, right? And this worsened the mistakes, the misunderstanding, the enmity between the nobility and the so-called third state. Purchasing and selling officers' brevets were customary things also in England, where, however, they were at least object of a clearer norm. However, not less common than in France, were there also the abuses and the appointments of incompetents. And in fact, it was, let's say, a feature, a dysfunction that that verified in the system by default. Right, the ancien regime functioned like that. There was nothing, it was just a broader clientelary, interested relation, right? And states were emerging in a ever more centralized fashion very gradually, right? From a world that was entirely like that since the Middle Ages, right? Thus, old captains coming from below, let's say, that had spent an entire life on the battlefields, found often themselves to have to obey to less than 30 years old colonels, less than 40 years old generals, that had in military art the competence that can be easily imagined. And the European picture is basically the same everywhere. Right, it's not surprising thus that it was, especially more than the higher nobility, that enjoying the favor of the courts didn't fear to be outclassed. Right, the petty nobility to defend, very very strongly its own prerogatives, their own privileges within the armed forces, not just there, by the way, because also in society, in civil life, it was basically the same, against the pressing, advancing demands of the bourgeoisie, right? And in fact, as a result, from a cultural point of view, the 18th century was the one in which, in absolute terms, was written about chivalric blood, values, the sense of honor, like in any other moment in history. Frederick the Great, that, as you know, was convinced exponent of the preservation of the social values, with their hierarchy as a pillar of the same military functionality in Prussia, reserved the officer's career only to the Junker, right? That, in fact, by the way, paid an enormous tribute of blood, as you know, during the 7 Years' War. We're talking about throughout these mid 18th century wars, it's been calculated that 70% of the Prussian nobility, of the Junker, was physically wiped out on the battlefield, right? The officers had to march together with their men, they had to simply perform their own maneuvers always in that way, and even if they could have, maybe won by running rather than closing in at the regular pace, no, they would go for it because that's what they had to do without even thinking, and, remaining under fire more than due and being cut down, right? And this, incidentally, was for Prussia actually a beneficial factor because of all the death of these aristocrats, the state could really centralize even more, because there were ever less families that would centralize ever more their assets, so they would become ever more oligarchic and ever more connected to the monarchy, right? It also, actually cash sometimes from these inheritances and so on, right? So that was another way, as we were saying before, there is nothing properly modern in this concept, differently from it was from a tactical point of view and the military genius of Frederick II. But specifically, there was a huge fear to be wiped out. Think about the miracles of the House of Brandenburg. Like Prussia risked easily to be wiped out of the map, just like, I don't know, would happen to Poland, in multiple occasions. And therefore there was also this enormous commitment properly of the aristocracy to take part even in this more risky realities. But from a social standpoint, that had always been that one, because the Junker emerged literally from feudal Europe. Right, if you look at those and you know, a few, it's the same thing. It was basically just latifundia, right? The huge estates held by these people. There wasn't much of a dramatic, you know, economical. But yeah, there was, in the sense that if we think about all the Protestants and the Jews that Prussia let immigrate in its own countries for you know, especially after, for example, the revocation of the Nantes Edict under the Sun King. You know, those were things that came straight from France, right, as working force, etc. But there was absolutely no comparison between, you know, Central Eastern Europe and, you know, countries like France, England, in terms of properly of scalar development of, you know, of state, right? But that helped. Similar thing actually happened in Austria, but at least nominally with less disciplinary standards, as you know. But even in there was a very intense negotiation between the crown and the local communities, and so they are very interesting stories. We could look at them sometimes. Also, there is another factor to take into consideration, is that in the Protestant countries, specifically, the nobility did not own that ecclesiastical career opportunity that instead existed in the Catholic ones. So this contributed to make its members to flow into the military cadres, right? So that there wasn't there was not much of an option proper. This happened in Prussia, for example, more than, however, in England, as we've seen that here, it's not much of an ecclesiastical problem, but rather the fact that England was richer, right? Many noblemen were absorbed by the cures of maritime trade, rather than, you know, thinking about getting themselves killed on some you know, useless battle, right? And this was properly you know, reflected, as we were saying before, by the different scale of how still this commissions properly happened in many countries, right? If you look at, I don't know, the countries where the nobility was actually still more in charge by default, right? So the more you shift, the eastern you shift, right, and the more you find this by a certain degree, because also, actually, Russia during the 18th century was, well, a bit everybody actually was, however, centralizing at that point. And as you know, this was also, as we've seen from the von Clausewitz videos, a moment in which literally every single European army was literally identical to each other, right? So even if there were naturally different political and social backgrounds, but at least in terms of mechanisms on the field, things were. But still, of course, the cohesion of an army was importantly based on the quality of their officers. So naturally, much was required to some rather than others. Anyhow, this was a bit to present the tension existing even at these ranking levels in the 18th century French armies. We will talk about these things extensively on different occasions. You know that basically at this point I'm covering mostly from Hellenistic to early modern, right? We rarely venture in the second modern age, but I'm planning to actually expand further, right? Recently we won't talk about properly contemporary warfare, and we'll keep doing it again at some point. For now, however, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.